The Persephone Foundation. Timeline Archives. Timeline designation XH-002. Codenamed Red Scare. The World, 2000. The Third World War eventually ground down into a brutal stalemate, roughly along the pre-war Iron Curtain. Following the rather worrying results of unrestrained atomic combat during the 1962 attempted Soviet drive on Hamburg, no nuclear weapons have since been deployed in the main European theater of war, even if one still occasionally goes off in the rest of the planet. The front is a broken mass of poisoned and irradiated dirt. Atomic-powered tanks make one hell of a mess when they get destroyed. Utterly contaminated. Troops do not permanently dwell in the battle zone, unlike in the First World War, but instead only move in either during an offensive or in response to an enemy offensive. Those troops, both of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, wear heavy suits to protect them from the poison lingering in the air and the worst of the radioactivity. Hulking tanks. Not much changed from their counterparts when the war began. Britain still uses Conqueror heavy tanks almost exclusively in Europe. Provide fire support for the troops, and jet fighters identical to those from the 50s duel over the blasted battlefields. However, although there are nearly constant skirmishes and small offensives along the front, the vast majority of troops remain in pre-assault positions far behind the lines. There they will be ready to exploit any chink in the armor of the other side, or react to any collapse of their own forward units. In their respective bunkers in Warsaw and Brussels, Marshal Putin of the Stavka and Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Thatcher, constantly run drills for an uncontrolled nuclear exchange, hoping that they will never need to test them for real. The world is divided into two blocks. Those of democracy, rather authoritarian, paranoid, and occasionally a bit military dictatorship-y, but still mostly democracy, and those of communism. But within these two alliances, there are three distinct powers that stand above the rest, and two that stand above even their fellow great powers. The leader of the Allied powers is the United States of America, which now stretches from the Yucatan to Japan, and is possibly the most technologically advanced nation on Earth. Not that this changes the fact that most US troops are issued with M14s, the laser weapons only being given to the most elite soldiers in the Army. That army resembles that which fought in the Korean campaign which started this entire damn mess, aside from the usual necessity of wearing a full NBC bodysuit to fight in the average battlefield of World War III. It is also huge, devoted to fighting both the land wars in Europe and Asia, but also waging the eternal island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, and fighting various internal menaces in America itself. Battleships, although supplanted somewhat by aircraft carriers, remain a key part of the US Navy and Royal Navy, although of course they bristle with surface-to-air missiles and fire low-yield atomic shells these days, and are primarily used to support amphibious attacks. Aircraft range from the conventional B-52s and MiGs, to the odd Valkyries and Harriers, to the utterly mad Soviet atomic power bombers. There are also manned, and stocked with atomic weapons, spacecraft in orbit. American society, like the rest of the world's, is pretty much a carbon copy of the 40s and 50s, if with some changes to cope with the seemingly endless struggle with the Red Menace, capitalized as per the Existential Dread of Communism Bill of 1972. Society remains unquestioningly religious, concerned with keeping up appearances, and incredibly paranoid. But when hordes of murderous communists really are trying to take over the world, Is this really that unreasonable? That is not to say that society has not evolved over the century, just in forms rather different to your timeline. The sexual revolution never happened. But given the demands of perpetual war, a female emancipation still did. Women-only units of the Army have been employed since the 70s. The Air Force is particularly keen on female fighter pilots, because they think they have faster reflexes. Yay for 50s pseudoscience! And women have been increasingly making inroads into the corridors of political power as well. Similarly, only a very few American states persist with segregation. North Carolina, we're looking at you. Since the whole occasional alien invasion thing makes racism seem a bit silly. Pretoria would disagree, but screw them. This is not to say that the US is utopian. Indeed, it is a very paranoid state with multiple competing intelligence agencies. The FBI for organized crime and communists, the CIA for sniffing out Reds abroad, the Un-American Affairs Bureau for any communist-related problem not covered by the first two, and Majestic 12 for alien invaders. All trying to ensure American security in the face of multiple nebulous threats. There's also the problem of said threats, and they're rampaging across multiple areas of the Empire of Liberty. That empire also includes Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan as protectorates, and annexed Mexico in the late 60s. Too many aliens and communists. It also includes the spacecraft of the United States Space Agency and lunar colonies of Moon Command, which incidentally house atomic rockets designed to bombard the Soviet Union. Given the ever-present risk of the atomic escalation of World War III, as well as the myriad threats of mutants and aliens, the USA has invested heavily in underground cities. So have the Soviets and Chinese, but the British just encourage people to move to Australia. These self-sufficient, all-American communities/armaments factories are designed to keep the United States functioning in the event of an uncontrolled atomic exchange with the Reds, allowing the survivors to prepare for the inevitable resumption of the war the moment the radiation dies down. No mineshaft gap here. The United States' main great power allies are the exhaustively named British Empire and Commonwealth, and the European coal and steel community. Britain, in a world where America was desperate for as much of the world to remain anti-red as possible, and as such did not object when Britain kicked Nasser in the teeth, and also didn't ask for vast amounts of gold during an economic depression, is doing much better. As a result, the British Empire had time to recover, and is now alive, well, and fairly, although politely, ferocious. Britain and her dominions remain closely associated. All the Dominion's flags are variations on the red, white, or blue ensigns, and Canada and Australia host large British military bases. Lots of blue streaks hosted in northern Canada and Western Australia. British and Commonwealth forces have two crucial roles in the NATO alliance, beyond the mandatory commitment to the European front, which is lower, however, than that borne by the Europeans and Americans. Firstly, they help supplement the US Navy with their own formidable naval forces, and secondly, they are NATO's prime enforcer in Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Asia. Britain's African colonies and dominions produce a vast amount of manpower, supplanting now independent India as Britain's main source of vast mercenary armies. The Royal Air Force also contributes to generally making the life of Soviet transport troops hell, sending in V-bombers to regularly smash practiced roads and railways with precision carpet bombing, and, of course, precision low-yield atomic weapons! Britain also runs a space program, by far the largest of any non-superpower effort, the British occupying an awkward halfway house between a mere great power and a true superpower, in collaboration with the Dominions. British and Commonwealth society is fairly similar to its American counterpart, except with the addition of fervent monarchism, mere religious worship of tea and cricket, and a propensity to get violent when things are spelt incorrectly. The European coal and steel community is the product of three things: utopianism, laziness, and ex-fascists. Utopianism set it up, laziness resulted in the name remaining the same even when it became a United States of Europe, and ex-fascists ended up staffing much of its military in the early days. Of course, most of the fascists are dead by now, but their legacy remains in the cut of European army uniforms and their general attitude towards the Reds, which can best be summed up as, "Why aren't we nuking them yet?" Dominated by the French. Combined, the West Germans and Italians can overrule them, however. They retain a few bits of colonial territory around the globe, not as much as the British, though. Being the main vanguard against communism is a bit distracting. However, the real authority in the ECSC is the High Authority. Centered in Luxembourg City, how the members of the unelected authority are selected is a closely guarded secret. They are actually a boringly pedantic group of technocrats. But this sounds cooler. Europe is dedicated towards one single goal: smashing the forces of the Warsaw Pact and occupying Eastern Europe. Virtually the entire European military is stationed in the East, although it is considerably less mechanized than its Soviet counterpart. While the Americans use laser rifles, some of them anyway, and the British are skipping around with bullpups, the average soldier of Europe is equipped with boringly conventional technology. However, Europe does possess a few superweapons. Most notably its absolutely huge and virtually unusable cobalt-jacketed bombs. Tested only once in what was once French West Africa. The effects of this humongous hydrogen bomb were horrific. A plume of radioactive dust annihilated all life for hundreds of miles downwind of the explosion, which was itself the largest in history. Of course, the fact that the bomb was the size of a large building, and the fact that any use of it in Europe to break the stalemate would result in devastating most of the continent, does limit its military effectiveness somewhat. But the Europeans keep one or two disassembled, ready to be put back together anywhere Luxembourg City wants, just in case. Their primary enemy is, of course, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the dark heart of international communism. The Soviet Union is a highly mechanized tyranny, in which the activities of every single citizen are planned and monitored by the state. This technocratic turn has helped the Soviet economy continue to cope with the demands of perpetual war. The fact that producing vast amounts of armaments is the only thing the Soviet economy is actually good at is a happy circumstance, even if the Chinese do mutter about deviationism. The cult of Stalin remains firmly intact. Premiers Molotov, Kaganovich, Cherdinko, and Davidova not really seeing much need to change what remains a key motivator for the Soviet people. Stalin comes and gives presents to all good little socially useful Soviet children every non-religious, arbitrarily chosen mandatory winter celebration date. And of course, the KGB is always watching. Although computers remain bulky, it is still easy enough to install a few cameras in the many communal areas in which Soviet citizens are required to frequent. Canteens, dormitories, etc. The USSR leads the world in experiments of a sanity-defying nature, frequently necessitating the creation of zones of alienation. The most infamous of these is the zone surrounding the Aral Sea, and the Soviet facility on Rebirth Island. NATO orbital reconnaissance have noted a large concrete pyramid at the center of the complex, surrounded by inward-facing fortifications. Whatever the hell is imprisoned in it, the Soviets refuse to say. However, given that they have stationed around 50,000 troops from the KGB, equipped with heavy armor and nuclear artillery, around it, it probably isn't anything good. The second most important member of the Warsaw Pact is the People's Republic of China, which dominates the Far East. If the USSR is communism as stultifying industrial tyranny, then the PRC is communism as a largely agrarian, permanent revolution. However, various great leaps forward, capitalization is very important, have given China enough of a war industry to supply its vast conscript armies, at the cost of about 100 million lives. The People's Liberation Army is by far the largest army in the world, outstripping even the Soviets and Americans. However, it is also one of the least technologically advanced of the great power armies, with most Red Guard militiamen equipped with little more than a primitive submachine gun or bolt-action rifle. The actual PLA itself is a bit better equipped, with AK-style weaponry nearly identical to that carried by much of the Red Army. China's one real technical advantage lies in its special forces, which are probably the best in the world, although the SAS and the North Korean Special Forces dispute this. Vast numbers of soldiers undergo brutal training programs in the Gobi Desert every year, the survivors of which are inducted into the Special Forces. Chinese commandos are infiltrators par excellence, capable of slipping behind enemy lines and wreaking havoc. Within that vast force of commandos are the elite of the elite, the Crimson Dragoons. Equipped with stealth armor, it bends light, somehow. They are capable of turning virtually invisible for short periods, enabling them to launch devastating ambushes, seemingly from nowhere. China also operates a large experimental facility in Manchuria, in which they test their brainwashing and indoctrination techniques. In addition to helping their socialist comrades with unruly populations, having found things much more effective than fluoride to put in the water, they also program POWs into a whole range of options. From assassins to spies, they will be totally unaware of their programming, until it comes into force upon hearing a pre-programmed password. The Warsaw Pact's third largest member is not really a communist state at all, but a nationalist state forged in the fires of the confrontation. However, they are bitter enemies of the British and Americans, and as such have aligned themselves with the USSR and China in order to get a good supply of weapons. Despite the name, Malfalindo is an Indonesian empire, run from Jakarta, by Jakarta, for Jakarta. Malfalindo wages perpetual war at its island peripheries, mostly against the British, who wish to avenge the humiliation of the second fall of Singapore. The slums of Indonesia are regularly scoured for new recruits, who are then given a crudely manufactured rifle and sent off to die in the sweltering jungle. As the main area of jungle under control of the Warsaw Pact, Indonesia is full of Chinese and Soviet biological warfare facilities. Occasionally, of course, the resultant creations escape and go on a blood-curdling rampage, or infect a few isolated villages, depending on what kind of gene-forged mutant escapes. Whatever the resultant horror, Indonesia is not a particularly nice place to live. Of course, progress has its costs. In this case, the worryingly large numbers of mutant monstrosities and other products of mad science rampaging across the globe. The most widespread of these are the Triffids, the USSR's effort at using science to create a single cash crop capable of meeting all the USSR's food and oil needs. As a result, they grow quickly in most climates, produce extremely large amounts of airborne seeds, and are ambulatory, intelligent, venomous, and carnivorous. The failure of the Soviets to contain the dandelion-like seeds, it turns out that just reclassifying the area above the farms as a no-fly zone was not enough to stop the seeds from spreading, has unfortunately resulted in these plants infesting large areas of the Soviet bloc, with Africa also suffering from increasing growths of these malevolent plants. When various Soviet allies and neutrals suffering from Triffid infestations complain to the Soviet Ministry of Experimental Sciences about this, they huffily respond, "Well, we can all have the benefit of hindsight," However, the Soviets do not have a monopoly on crazed biological experimentation. Operation Lazarus began innocently enough. Well, as innocently as any US Army-run project to regenerate maimed soldiers' limbs by means of experimenting on alligators can be. The aim of the project was to utilize the incredible regenerative abilities of many reptiles to regrow soldiers' limbs, enabling them to be sent back to the front. It was going brilliantly, apart from the somewhat greenish look of the new limbs, or the subject's ravenous hunger for raw meat, or the other crocodilian features spreading across their bodies, or the fact that the condition seemed to be spread by biting, or the fact that several of the resultant monstrosities escaped into nearby waterways and have spread across the deep south like a plague. The resultant gatormen look humanish at first, but as they take on injuries, their regenerative abilities go out of control. Some of the earliest of these mutants are now hulking and heaving masses of reptilian tissue, with multiple limbs and heads, those heads covered with clusters of slitted yellow eyes and multiple slavering jaws. Florida is not a popular place to retire in this United States. The baleful influence of radioactivity is also responsible for the creation of numerous accidental monstrosities, the most stable two breeds of which are them and the mushroom monsters. They are a breed of mutated ants, whose respiratory systems have become considerably more sophisticated than their microscopic brethren. This allows them to grow much, much larger than their non-mutant counterparts. The average one of them is around 3 meters in height, with jaws capable of crushing bone and mouth parts which spray blinding clouds of concentrated formic acid. This breed began their life in western Arizona, altered by fallout drifting east from the US testing grounds in Nevada. They now infest the majority of the state, and have begun to spread to California and New Mexico. The US military is trying to burn them out, but Arizona is probably lost, with most of the population concentrated in a few heavily defended cities, although the danger of the bugs tunneling in is ever present. Some military planners are thinking about detonating atomic weapons underground, in a bid to cause tunnel-collapsing earthquakes. Others have suggested that trying to solve something caused by atomic radiation with more atom bombs is a rather bad idea. Meanwhile, spreading relentlessly across the Pacific, carried by spores on birds or ships, are the mushroom monsters. They are a parasitic species, originating following a rather large hydrogen bomb test in Micronesia, although some have suggested that they evolved naturally on a very remote island. They are possibly the most invasive species in the history of the planet, taking over every single element of an ecosystem by either hyper-aggressive growth or by assimilation. The fungus incorporates other organisms at the cellular level, altering the victim's DNA and incorporating its physiology into its own. Although the immune system is usually capable of defeating the occasional stray spore, prolonged contact with fungal spores, or eating one of the mushroom monster's fruiting bodies, is normally enough to assimilate most forms of animal and vegetable life. Most forms of life become bizarre hybrids, their physiology a cross between the native and the alien. Trees, for example, retain their structure and ability to photosynthesize, and some human victims become humanoid mushrooms, shambling horrors spreading the infection wherever they go. Others just mutate into bloated mushrooms, fruited bodies emitting vast quantities of spores. It is spreading from island to island, carried by birds. Bird lands on infected island, bird eats some fungal growths, bird flies to new island, bird turns into large mutant fruiting body, new island is infected, etc. Recently, the mushroom monsters have reached the Philippines and New Guinea, to the considerable panic of both power blocks. Then there are the horrors of ages past and the remote regions of the world, awoken by atomic explosions, digging too deep, or by the voracious demands of the superpowers for more weapons. The most common of these are the various prehistoric monstrosities, released from their icy/subterranean imprisonment by reckless nuclear testing. One region of the Greenland ice sheet has been abandoned by Anglo-American forces, after attempts to create air bases powered by atomic power ended up releasing a specimen of giant, supposedly extinct mantis. This mantis proved surprisingly cold-resistant and quite good at swimming, and ended up rampaging across large areas of New England before being put down. Following this, all troops were pulled out of the region. They were sent back when submarine-landed KGB troops began deliberately melting the ice. Skirmishes abound across the region, made more interesting by the occasional gigantic insect. Also a bit of a problem was the gigantic rampage across Japan by a dinosaur, preserved on a remote island. Imagine Skull Island, but less Weetas, mutated horribly by a nuclear test. This proved the catalyst for Japan becoming a protectorate of the US. Considerably more unpleasant was the result of the mushroom monsters infecting one of these beasts. That took hydrogen bombing to get rid of. Various monstrosities have also arisen from the depths of swamp and cave. In California, vibrations from distant atomic tests have awoken the Gornaxis, prehistoric mollusks buried in caverns below the San Andreas Fault. These monstrous snails of doom have been overrunning much of the state, and with the US Army busy dealing with them, there is only the National Guard to deal with them. They aren't doing very well. There is also the amphibious gill men, who have emerged from the brackish swamps of the Amazon in response to increased drilling. It is unknown what happens to those whom they drag away to their aquatic lairs, although the general scientific opinion is that it probably isn't anything good. But with the Brazilian Civil War absorbing most people's attention, they continue to spread without hindrance. A more embarrassing horror, which is spreading rapidly across the western US, is that of the Borgia plague. There are many horrible metamorphic ailments in this world of science! The Gatormen, the mushroom monsters, the crystallizing effects of the monolith monsters, because alliteration is great, the sheer oh, please no! Of the thing, and of course the baleful influence of radioactivity, all warp the human form into something disgusting, alien, and utterly monstrous. Apart from the Borgia plague, which turns people into dogs. Yes, you heard that right. According to research, it was utilized as a weapon by the Borgia family, hence the name. Whatever its origins, it is causing considerable trouble to the United States as it spreads across the Midwest. Indeed, the US Army has had to begin quarantining entire states and enacting shoot-to-kill orders in order to try and stifle its spread. The governor of Wyoming claimed in a press release that it was completely under control, although commentators did argue that her slowly turning into a German shepherd during her speech undermined her credibility somewhat. The final, and most existentially terrifying threat, are aliens from beyond the Earth. These are surprisingly common in the world of the year 2000, and pose a significant risk to the continued human occupation of the Earth. The most obvious of these alien threats are the Saucermen, whose disc-shaped craft occasionally descend in great fleets to ravage human cities and blow up all of our historic landmarks. Exactly why they do this is unknown, but when combined with their technological supremacy and extremely annoying habit of playing jokes with death rays, it has made them utterly hated by mankind. The other clearly sentient aliens are the ones whom have colonized the deepest abysses of the sea. From what contacts humanity has been able to make with them, which are conducted by the British, who are delighted to find the aliens enthused by monarchy and competitive sports with rules so arcane that it requires decades of study to understand them. They appear to be relatively benevolent. Regardless, plans exist to detonate hydrogen bombs in the ocean depths. But for now, mankind has more pressing concerns. First among these are the monolith monsters, gigantic crystallizing monstrosities, as their name suggests, which are spreading worldwide. These stone-like aliens leach nutrients from the surrounding area, or from surrounding people, and spread extremely quickly. They came from meteorites, like the blob, which has become quite an annoying pest, living in sewers worldwide. They occasionally come back up the U-bend, which is fairly unpleasant. Most countries' sewer maintenance staff carry flamethrowers, which landed in 3 locations: California, Northern Siberia, and Central Africa. Of these, the Californian is the most limited, thanks to intense management and occasionally bombardment with low-yield nuclear weapons. Radiation causes the monoliths to mutate and screws them up. They are much less efficient and develop strange cancerous growths. Some even disintegrate completely into inert dust. Of course, this does limit the number of troops available for the other myriad horrors romping over the Southwest. The pod people are also a problem. They keep infiltrating towns worldwide, acting out their victims' lives exactly, and, well, that seems to be it. Indeed, if it weren't for all the kidnapping, no one would really notice. Best to just shoot 'em, just in case. Then, of course, there is the thing. As to what it is, no one has any idea. Indeed, a thing is the closest anyone can get. It seems to be shape-shifting, extremely aggressive, extremely infectious, capable of mimicking anything, and generally seems to be, in the words of the British representative to the UN, not a terribly nice chap. It is one of the few points of agreement between the Warsaw Pact and NATO that, if the thing ever shows any sign of escaping Antarctica, both blocs will put aside their differences, but not their nukes. Their precious, precious nukes. To try and kill it with atomic fire! Till then, the Third World War rages on. Blocs and powers of note. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Composing nations. The United States of America. Now extremely paranoid and militaristic. Not necessarily unreasonable given the hordes of aliens and communists trying to take over the planet. The United States is the main supplier to the NATO forces, but also suffers from considerable internal problems due to mutants and aliens. The US also possesses one of the world's largest space forces, and has a large number of bases on the moon, to act as continuity centers in the event of uncontrolled atomic exchange on Earth. Currently intervening in Brazil, and hoping against hope that the Soviets don't respond. The British Empire and Commonwealth. Britain and her dominions remain closely associated, and form the majority of NATO forces in Africa and Southern Asia. Britain maintains a large research and development program, even if the plant-like parasite brought back by the space program did nearly consume the East End, before being stopped by the mysterious Professor Q. Britain has plans to return to India if the civil war there gets much worse. The European Coal and Steel Community. One of the more authoritarian of the NATO powers, with the European military being the strongest force on the continent. Bearing the cost of 50 years of total war against the Reds, has left Europe empty and utterly militarized, but still resolutely committed to complete victory over the Warsaw Pact. Its capital is Luxembourg City. Other NATO-aligned. An interesting mix of democracies, semi-democracies, and military dictatorships whose only qualification for being in this alliance is not being communists. The Warsaw Pact. Composing nations. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union has been trying to conquer the world for about 50 years now, and the Politburo is beginning to get a bit disappointed by their failure to do so, but still, the men and women of the Soviet forces continue to labor for the good of the world revolution. Or else. Legions of atomic super tanks, atomic super bombers, and atomic super cruisers will leave the entire world prostrate before the will of the Vozd, as long as whatever the Soviets have in the concrete pyramid on Rebirth Island stays there. The People's Republic of China. The USSR's rather grumpy number 2 within the communist bloc. The PRC has ambitions of usurping leadership from Moscow. The vast Chinese Air Force wages eternal war with the US forces based out of America's East Asian protectorates, as a prelude to an eventual Chinese invasion. China also possesses advanced infiltration forces, which even operate on the US mainland. The United Republic of Malfalindo. Actually a nationalist military dictatorship and not a communist state. The URM does, however, require Soviet and Chinese arms to help fight British and American forces in Indonesia. It hosts a lot of Warsaw Pact research labs in its jungles and volcanoes, the products of which occasionally escape to wreak havoc. Other Warsaw Pact, mostly Soviet or Chinese puppets, and as such, are totalitarian communist dictatorships. Neutral powers. The Iberian Union. A confederation between the two fascist dictatorships of the Iberian Peninsula. Iberia is under the domination of the Phalange, who have purged their monarchist and Catholic allies. Allied with the South Africans, they are the only people who will now deal with them. The Republic of Brazil. The integralist government is collapsing to a communist uprising in the south of the country, which has resulted in American intervention on the side of the democratic forces in the northwest. The Amazon basin has also mostly fallen to a race of prehistoric amphibian lizardmen. The United Kingdoms of Scandinavia. Neutral and very, very scared of more or less everything. Generally the main supplier of troops maintaining the Antarctic quarantine perimeter, since the NATO and Pactist troops have a habit of shooting at each other. The United Arab Republic, run by the Ba'athist Party in collaboration with Nasser's successors, leans towards Team Red, but the presence of large amounts of British troops, equipped with atomic weapons, in Britain's Canal Zone prevents them from joining the Warsaw Pact as of the present time. The Indian Union. India is increasingly stuffed. The ongoing brutal civil war with the Maoists has blended into a war for survival against the myriad mutant and alien horrors attempting to gain control of the subcontinent. The Republic of South Africa. Still apartheid and the only non-great power with an atomic arsenal. South Africa is still a deeply unpleasant country, but has resisted the urge to go utterly crazy and Nazi-esque, so far. South Africa has plans for intervention in the rest of Africa if its situation gets worse. Other neutrals, mostly busy panicking. Inhumans. The monolith monsters. These silicoidal aliens are one of the major threats to the human race. They crystallize all organic and much inorganic material wherever they are found. However, their growth can be limited by radiation and their own crystalline diseases, which they brought with them on a meteor. The Krakens. These aliens are believed, given their habitat it's jolly hard to find out anything about them, to have colonized the deepest abysses of the ocean. Rudimentary communication has been established. It is now known that they understand basic mathematics and the concept of tea time, but they mostly ignore the powers above. Humanity couldn't really care less. There is the Third World War to win, after all. Pod people. Constantly attempting to infiltrate mankind, and resulting in mandatory blood tests in the West, and mandatory brainwashing in the East. These malevolent doppelgangers often try to take over small rural towns. They then try to use these as a basis for future expansion. Shown are the only known and purged infestations. The alligator people. These reptilian creatures are slowly taking over the entire southeast of the United States. This has resulted in the locals becoming much more trigger-happy, the government supplying them with the armor-piercing weaponry required to kill these things. Mushroom monsters. Their infestation of much of the Pacific was bad enough, but now that they have begun to expand into New Guinea and the Philippines, they have become an existential threat to humanity in those regions. Both the red and blue blocs are considering saturation atomic bombing of infected regions. Gornaxis. Prehistoric gastropods released from their underground habitat by an earthquake. They are reproducing incredibly quickly and spreading throughout California. Saucer raids. These invaders from beyond the moon keep attacking human cities. No one knows why. They are, however, very advanced, very aggressive, and deeply irritating. Triffids. Monstrous plant mutants which are beginning to infest large areas of the Soviet bloc. The products of crazed Soviet biotech. They are beginning to pose a serious threat to India in particular, along with quite a lot of other things. Them! Ants! Hordes of these acid-spewing monsters are overrunning much of the Southwest. The US Army is responding with a considered and sensible tactic, namely mass napalming and daisy-cuttering. Borgia plague outbreaks. The frequency with which people turn into dogs is something of a problem in modern America, particularly since dogs, unlike massive mutant monstrosities, are hard to individually target by airstrikes. Radioactive death zones. There are rather a lot of these across the globe, in varying degrees of size. Often horribly mutated monstrosities wander these wastelands, occasionally breaking into more civilized areas to wreak havoc. Ground Zero itself is often simply a morass of black radioactive glass. V-Zone. The Soviets claim that this is just another radioactive wasteland, but NATO intelligence assets have uncovered the truth. In this area, space-time is warped, with the greatest level of distortion occurring in a massive facility on Rebirth Island itself. The surrounding Aral Sea is infested with monstrous mutants, twisted far beyond the influence of mere radioactivity. The Soviets only crew the border walls, and the massive facility itself. NATO has a lot of nukes pointed at it, just in case. Gillmen. Fishy monsters who are busy ravaging human settlements throughout the Amazon Delta. Have primitive technology, mostly Stone Age, but also have trained beasts at their command, allowing them an edge over the local human militias. The Thing. Whatever the hell caused lots of Antarctic outposts to go silent in the 80s appears to have spread over much of the continent. Radio messages requesting help still occasionally emerge, but considering that the voices come from those known to have died quite horribly during the initial outbreaks, the general scientific opinion is that it probably isn't survivors. Points of interest. Some US officials are debating whether purging the Californian ulcer with nuclear fire is the best approach, but the Californians' continued electoral college votes prevent it, for now. Some prat with a beard tried to launch a revolution here. Lucky for its current leader, Batista III, that the CIA saw him off. Pro-democracy rebels. Pro-communism rebels. American occupation zone. All in all, Brazil is doing terribly well. The British government regularly checks everyone for signs of infestation by the Thing. Not complete and utter gits, but pretty damn close. Communists! Given the rate at which the Congo infestation was expanding, Britain had to create a radioactive death zone to protect its East African colonies. The ECSC tried experimenting with using monolith monsters to gather valuable resources into one easy-to-harvest package. Ireland seems to have a lot of trouble with changelings these days. Moscow is wondering whether it should just absorb its European puppets. This is just a completely normal atomic weapons production facility meltdown. This, on the other hand, MacArthur got permission to do his invincible wall of cobalt thing. Hasn't really worked. Being a US pilot on Taiwan, and facing the entire People's Liberation Army Air Force, isn't much fun. Malfalindo is beginning to panic as the mushroom monsters spread west. Soviet atomic bombers are on standby. Woomera is where the British Ministry of Space launches its rockets from, with contributions from the entire Commonwealth. This has been a Persephone Foundation Timeline Reading. Thank you for listening.